You're listening to the Grassroots Church podcast. We're a Jesus-centered community in Thunder Bay, Ontario. You can learn how to participate more by going to our website at grassroots.church.
Man, that was a great prelude to Christmas this morning, wasn't it? Some good singing from everyone, and especially our young choir. I know that they have put a lot of work into that, so I really appreciate it, and it shows. So well done. This morning we are exploring joy, as we've been singing, as we've been speaking about already this morning, as we are into the third week of Advent. For those who maybe haven't been with us lately or haven't been tracking with our podcast, last week we talked about peace and peace in the way of Jesus versus peace in the way of Caesar, and what does that look like? And then the week before that we spoke about hope. And how, as followers of Jesus, we can hold and be very realistic about the reality of the despair and the challenges and suffering of this present life, and yet simultaneously hold on to a hope that is a promise of deliverance from this. And how do we live that way? And so that's kind of what we've been talking about. And this theme is a weary world rejoices. And so we're talking about, what do these gifts of Advent offer us as Jesus followers? We who are weary, a world who is weary, a world who is looking for answers and hope and reprieve from the despair of life, the challenges and suffering of life. And so this morning, we are going to continue this journey into the topic of joy. And I have to say off the top this morning, and maybe you relate to this, but I have a fairly complicated relationship with joy. I'm curious, do you also have, raise your hand if you're like, yeah, this has always been a challenge. Yeah, some of us are on that same page. And those of us who have kind of grown up with Advent messages on joy, or, spent many years listening to messages about joy, will no doubt recognize that joy differs from happiness, and that unlike happiness, joy is not merely pleasure or sensation dependent on our circumstances, but rather, as Dallas Willard says, joy is a pervasive and constant sense of well-being. So it's more than a feeling of elation that comes and goes. Joy is, at least biblical joy, is supposed to be sort of this constant disposition or posture that encompasses the entire body, the entire human experience, and transcends the circumstances of our lives. That's how many of us have grown up understanding joy. That's how the Bible speaks of joy. And to be honest, I know this is true in theory, right? We all sort of understand that. It sounds right. And I would say that probably for most of us, maybe even all of us, I would say that this is the desire of our heart. We want that posture. We want that disposition to be true of us. But honestly, I'm not so sure it is. And please hear me, I don't mean to paint all of us with broad strokes, to kind of generalize everyone, although I'm about to. But you look around at the church, and maybe as a general rule we can say this, that it seems that this idea of a sustained, sort of deep-seated joy that is to define us as the body of Christ is often, or sometimes maybe, or I don't know how often or typically you might say this, it's missing. Right? I mean, worry, yeah, you can look at us and say, yeah, they worry. Fear, yeah, we live by fear. Many of us do. Anxiety, that's present. But joy as sort of like the defining thing that we are, like when people look at us, they're like, what a joy-filled people. That's how it's supposed to be. But is it? And I don't know if it is. I was reflecting a little bit about this topic this week as I was preparing, and I had to say, like, this past year and a bit as a pastor has been maybe the most joy-filled I've been in my life. And I'll talk about a little bit why I think that is later on this morning. But at the end of the day, we have to admit, I think if we're honest, that most of us have a complicated relationship with the topic of joy. And probably all of us have a desire to muster more joy in our lives. And I know I do for sure. Especially the kind of joy that the Bible seems to be getting at, this sort of innate joy that transcends our circumstances. And so this morning, I want us to consider just one thing, one small thing. Chris wants me to go fast, so I'm going to try to get through this right away. Come on. But it is admittedly a challenging thing. And it is the cause for, I think, our joy shortcomings and potentially yours as well. And maybe if what is said here this morning lands with you as it does with me, then maybe we can move that needle of joy just a little bit from this sort of sporadic, circumstantial joy toward a more sustained disposition of joy. That's the desire this morning. So I want to look at just one thing. And the way we're going to do that is I am going to just do a whole bunch of proof texting of the Bible this morning, which everyone loves to do. It's not a great way of teaching the Bible, I realize that, but the way that I'm going to kind of present this point, this argument I want to make, is by just sharing a bunch of verses on joy from the New Testament, okay? And so it's going to be like a fire hose I'm going to fire at you. Let me just go through this, and then we'll talk about it. Let's start in the book of joy. What is the book of joy in the New Testament? Who knows their Bible? Philippians, good work. Danica, excellent. Philippians, yes, Philippians 4, verse 4. Paul says this, rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. We'll talk more about this in a sec, but now just consider that this here is a command from the Apostle Paul. He says this again earlier in chapter 3, verse 1. He says, further, my brothers and sisters, rejoice in the Lord. Hebrews 12:2 says, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Jesus, going to the cross, does so with joy. Hold that in your mind, and then let's zoom a few books back in the Bible to Acts chapter 16, verse 25. It says this, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God. They were rejoicing, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Okay, so while you're thinking of that passage, just fast forward a bit to James chapter 1. First few verses of this chapter reads, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kind, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Okay, that's not enough. One more. 1 Thessalonians. This is, 1 Thessalonians 1, verse 6. You became imitators of us and the Lord, for you welcomed the message in the midst of severe suffering with the joy given by the Holy Spirit. So I will contend this morning there are two kind of overarching themes or factors that contribute to joy, and I think both are necessary for us to tap into the sort of sustained joy that we're trying to get at this morning. Let's start with the first one, Philippians 4. Rejoice always, and again, I will say rejoice. Now, this word rejoice comes from the Latin word, and it means to show great joy and delight. Okay, so this is a command. And biblically speaking, again, this refers to this sort of deep spiritual joy rooted in God and his promises, and it transcends our circumstances. So what is the circumstance, though, that Paul is writing in? If you know your biblical context, Paul is in prison. He's in chains, most likely in Rome, and he is awaiting for the decision about what's going to happen with him. He might be facing death. His circumstance is a potential death sentence while he sits writing this letter of joy. He mentions the word joy or rejoice 16 times in this 4-chapter letter. It's full of joy, and his circumstance is one decidedly not pleasant. And the source of his joy as you can see in the different passages throughout this epistle, is Jesus, and specifically the promise of deliverance that Jesus offers. Because there's a good chance he's not going to survive in this prison, in the circumstance he's in, and yet he's full of joy because he puts his promise, his hope, in the deliverance that Jesus will provide for him. What about Hebrews? This passage in Hebrews. Here the author is referring to Jesus who endures the cross in pursuit of joy, for the joy set before him, it says. So Jesus suffers, his circumstances, one, not great, and joy results. Why is he joyful? Because he knows that through the cross is the promise of deliverance. This passage in Acts, where do we find Paul and Silas? They are rejoicing. They are in prison. A few verses before that, verse 22 and 23 talks about how Paul and Silas were flogged. They were beaten with rods. And now they sit in this prison with prisoners all around them, and they are singing hymns, rejoicing. So they've suffered. And why are they able to sing songs of praise and to rejoice? Because they are trusting in the deliverance that is promised them. Do we start to see a pattern emerging here? James literally says, consider it pure joy when you face trials and tribulations. When you experience hardships, consider that joy. Verse 12 of that same passage in James says this, blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. And so he's saying we experience joy in our suffering. Why? Because the promise of deliverance. There is this crown of life that Jesus is offering. And you can then experience joy as a result. In 1 Thessalonians, Paul again says, you welcome this message in the midst of suffering, of severe suffering. How? With joy, right? I think I'm one too many, but that's okay. How can you hold joy? Because despite your circumstance, there is a hope of deliverance. And so what is the common thread here this morning? What are the two sort of factors I am seeing again and again? And you can take a look at many other passages throughout the New Testament, including stories about Christmas, the story of Mary and Elizabeth, which I'm taking out this morning because Chris said to go fast, so I'm not going to talk about that. But another example of joy between these cousins, Elizabeth and Mary, as they anticipate in the midst of their suffering as Jews in an occupied land, in the midst of their suffering and of their oppression, they are full of joy because of the promise of deliverance. So what are the two things? First, they are beleaguered. I like this word, beleaguered. It means, it comes from sort of military terms, but it means they are under siege. They are oppressed. They are surrounded by difficult circumstances. They are persistently troubled. It's like this is the way of life of these people is hardship. And in each context that we looked at in the last few minutes here, we find the subject or the subjects are in difficult and even desperate situations. That's their circumstance. They're in prison. They are suffering. They've just been flogged. They are going to the cross. Like all of them are under hardship. And then the second thing is they are banking on deliverance. Their joy is based on the hope of a promise of a God who is good and who has promised to deliver them either in the present circumstance or beyond. The restoration of all things, a term we constantly use in our community. And I like, again, what Willard says here about joy. So he says that hope in the goodness of God is joy's indispensable support. Hope in the goodness of God. You cannot have joy unless you have hope in the goodness of God. It is indispensable. You have to cling to the promise of a God who is good. And so, insofar as biblical joy is understood, these two must go together in order for us to tap into joy. Because if all you have is hardship, but there's no hope of deliverance, that's not joy. People without hope have a hard time tapping into joy. But equally, think about it the other way. If you don't have any hardship to be delivered from, why are you rejoicing about deliverance? There's nothing to be delivered. So that's not joy either. So with these two things in mind, beleagueredness, I don't know if that's a word, but let's use that, and deliverance as our two sort of like ingredients or factors that we want to say required for joy, or maybe not required, but at least one avenue toward joy. I'll concede that there are other avenues as well, but this morning we're going to just focus on this. With these two things in mind, let's turn inward and consider our own circumstances. Let me speak for myself here. And if any of this is true for you, then great. But let's start with the second one, banking on deliverance. So I'm there. I'm at least most days, I would confess that my hope is in the promised deliverance of Jesus in my life and of our circumstance, and I put my hope and my faith in the restoration of all things. That is absolutely essential to the life of a Jesus follower. Right? I believe that God is good, that he's perfectly revealed in the person of Jesus. And because I look at the character of Jesus, I can trust that God has my best interest in mind, that he loves me unconditionally, and that he wants me to be healed. He wants me to be delivered from whatever it is I'm suffering from. And so I trust in that, and I want to live for that. We proclaim that boldly here at Grassroots Church. That is core to the message of what Grassroots stands for. We believe in a God who is at work restoring all things. Let me just finish that quote from Dallas Willard about his definition of joy that I began at the beginning. He says this: joy is a pervasive sense of well-being that is infused with hope and confidence because of the goodness of God. That is so key. Again, it's indispensable. This hope is indispensable to joy. And so this needs to be true for all of us. That our salvation, our deliverance, is the promise we cling to and we place at the center of our lives. At the center, it is the foundation from which all other things emerge. Great. But what about the first point? Am I beleaguered? Am I feeling as if the world is closing in on me on all sides? Well, friends, I can definitively say that is not my circumstance. The odds are not against me for surviving. Like, that's just not my reality. Now, have there been situations in my life where I've endured hardships? There have been seasons, there have been moments. But I'll be honest, I've never had my life threatened. I have not been on the underside of a society that has oppressed me. In fact, if I'm perfectly honest with you, I carry a lot of privilege. I'm white. I'm male. I'm middle class. I'm educated. I'm a Christian, which in this society, despite what some might say, is still a privilege. It's still an advantage, right? I have a lot of privilege. And as such, being persecuted, being oppressed, troubled, beleaguered, that's just not my reality. And for many of you, I assume it's the same. We are many of us, and I'm not saying all of us in this situation, but many of us are profoundly privileged. And hear me say this, I am grateful for that privilege. And so if, as these scriptures suggest, joy arises from struggle and hardships are anchored in the hope of deliverance, then perhaps the absence of such trials and challenges and hardships explains the lack of deep, lasting joy in our lives. And it seems that most of the sociological data that has come out on gauging the mental health and well-being of societies over the last number of years would support this as well, especially in the West. We've all read these studies. that despite unprecedented levels of privilege, whether it's our wealth, whether it's access to healthcare, whether it's access to education, the levels of sadness and depression and anxiety are alarmingly high, aren't they? Far higher than in other parts of the world where such privilege doesn't exist. This isn't difficult to demonstrate either. I mean, we see the examples of this stuff all around, not necessarily even within Christian communities. This past week, this is a quick example, you may have seen in the news the regime in Syria under Bashar al-Assad had fallen. And I think him and his family have been in charge since like 1971, and his people have experienced just unprecedented suffering. I heard a number about 600,000 people have been just gone missing or killed. And so there was just like this life of suffering that these people had in Syria, right? I saw this tweet or X post or whatever you call it, and you probably can't read it, but this is a man, and he says this the day after the regime had fallen. He says, no killing, no airstrikes, no starvation, no injuries, no sieges, no loss of our loved ones or ourselves. The killer is gone. It's hysterical. For hours with no sleep, I am still unable to process this, unable to grasp that Syria is free. Our country is ours again. Now, most of us in the West have simply no way of comprehending a perpetual existence of daily confronting killing and airstrikes and hunger. And is there any wonder why this man sheds tears of pure joy at the deliverance from such fear and oppression? Any cause of deliverance from suffering will yield joy, I think. I think we can say that confidently. Okay, so what do we do with this then? So because of my circumstance, because of the privilege, are we destined as a privileged people to have shallow and fleeting joy the rest of our days? Is that sort of like, wow, that's a drawback? I don't think so. I don't think as followers of Jesus, that's an option. And I have three things to kind of close about this that I think will come together and will demonstrate how do we tap into joy. And so let's just go on to them. The first one is we are relational beings. Joy is contagious. And 3, integral to the life of faith is the call to serve. And let's talk about how these things intersect. So first of all, we are relational beings. This means that if you and I are in relationship with one another, if we have a connection of sort, if we share community together as we are created to do, that means when you go through suffering and hardship, in theory, I experience that as well. That's how it should be. That your hardship affects me. Your suffering should affect me. Okay, that's what it means to be in relationship. And the word we have for that is called empathy. And empathy should be a virtue, a value, whatever this term is. It should be something that defines us as a people, that we should feel the pain and suffering of one another. That's the first part. That's what it means to be in relationship. That's what it means to be a relational being, okay? To bear each other's burdens, the Apostle Paul says. But there's a flip side to that, and this is where the second part comes in. Joy is contagious. Because being relational means not only do we experience the hardships and challenges of one another, but when we experience joy, we also get to experience that with one another. Amen? That other people's deliverance from whatever their hardship is, whatever joy they have, if you are in connection and relationship with that individual, if we as a community are paying attention to one another's needs, and we see those needs, those challenges being alleviated, if we see deliverance taking place, then their joy is our joy in a very real way. We experience the joy of one another. We get to tap into each other's joys in the journey from difficulty to deliverance. That's how joy spreads. Your deliverance from suffering is not your joy alone. It is all of ours. right? And we've all been there. We've all, I imagine, maybe it's just me because I'm extroverted, but when I experience something profoundly positive in my life, in the same way that when I experience something profoundly negative, my desire is to share it with other people so that they can enter into that joy with me, yeah? That's my default practice. And I don't know if that's just because, like I said, I'm extroverted or whatever, but that's how I get by in life. I love sharing the good, but I also love sharing the bad. I need someone to help carry that burden with me. And so joy is contagious because we want to share that. But then the third part, and this is so important. In fact, this is the crux of the entire message this morning. I think I have it on there. Those of us who might carry privilege, those of us who are advantaged in one way or another, depending, it kind of doesn't matter how you define that. If you have privilege of any form, privilege of any sort, Jesus followers are called to use that privilege, hear me say this, to enter into the hardship and the difficulty and beleagueredness of our neighbor. We are called to use our privilege to help alleviate suffering for others. And when we do that, joy ensues. Joy is the result of that, of serving. So do you want more joy this Advent? Is joy elusive to you? Has it been something that you've just been having a complicated relationship with as a follower of Jesus? I will charge you this morning. I will challenge you this morning that it begins at finding needs around you and doing what you are empowered to do, what you have been privileged to do, to offer, to help others be lifted from their circumstances. And so it doesn't mean that we have to be masochistic and, flog ourselves metaphorically in order for us to enter into joy. That's not what the Bible would teach. The Bible would teach, let us just find where there is hardship, suffering around, and then if we can do something about that, do it. Do it. You see, in your own life, in the friends and the sphere that you have influence over, if you see addiction, if you see poverty, if you see financial strife, if you see housing struggles, if you see a relational breakdown between friends and family, is there a role you can play in one of those things, in one of those relationships with the people you know, with strangers on the street? Honestly, it kind of doesn't even matter. If you can bring yourself to serving others, you can tap into the joy that they experience in their deliverance. And I mentioned earlier that this role as a pastor has, over the past year and a bit, has brought me heaps of joy. And that's because, and I'm not saying this to suck up to anyone, I'm saying this very truthfully, the best part of my job has been to sit with you folks each week to hear about your struggles, hear about the circumstances you're in your life, the challenges you're going through with family, with whatever realities you're going through that are hard, and to pray with you, and to sit there and offer you a word of encouragement, not necessarily a solution to your problems, but just even be present with you in that, and to not just leave it there, but to then experience the joy of deliverance that comes from that. Whatever circumstance you're in, to see you coming out on the other side and to call me up or to send me a text and say, hey, this is the latest. It doesn't always end up that way, but I'll tell you when it does, it warms my heart. It brings me so much joy to see that. And it's just what a gift, what an honor to serve this group of humans who, just like everyone else, has their own struggles and hardships, right? But for me to be able to sit there as a pastor and just give you a hug or offer a warm word of encouragement or whatever it is, that to me has been why I think, experienced so much more joy in my life in the last year and a half. What a blessing to be able to do that. So this is why service is not an optional add-on for the followers followers of Jesus. It's commanded. Paul is commanding us to rejoice, and the way we find joy is by helping others out. Then it is essential that we help each other out, that we help those around us. Right? One of the keys, again, not the only key, but one of the keys I'm convinced of as I study the scriptures, as I look at the example of Jesus, is to just be consistently willing to show up for those who are hurting, for those who are struggling, whatever that looks like, whatever way that we are equipped to do, whatever way we are privileged to do. Realizing, of course, that takes sacrifice, but to show up and then to just help see them through it. To be an agent of joy is to be an agent of hope in the one who promises deliverance. That's what we build our faith around. That's what we build our hope on. So, there's a long way to get there. Hopefully that wasn't too long, Chris. We're done. Okay? We're good. A long way to get there. And again, I don't know that this is the only way to joy. I'm sure there are other ways, and we can talk about this topic for a long time. But this morning, I want to ask us, what does it look like this Advent for you? If joy as a sustained general sense of well-being has been something you've been wrestling with in your life, as I have, right? This is a challenge for you. It's a challenge for me. Who in your life, your friends, your family, strangers on the street, can you interact with, hear their story, hear where they're at, and find a way to just maybe lift them out of that so that you can nudge that needle a little bit more away from these sporadic moments of happiness that we might call joy to more of a sustained, like, this is how we live. This is how people see us. How are we going to do that this Advent? I invite the band to come back up as we close in prayer. Father, man, we're so grateful that you promise us joy. We look at these commands in Scripture to rejoice, and sometimes we wonder, like, how? And yet you've shown us how. And so this morning, as we reflect on our own relationship, whether it's complicated or not, with joy, would you reveal to us needs in our lives, the world around us, in the spheres that we have influence over? Would you reveal to us beleagueredness, hardship, those whose lives feel like the world is crashing in on them? Would you help us to see those needs and then just find ways of alleviating it in order to bring joy to them, but also to tap into that joy that often is elusive? That's our prayer this morning. Pray this in your name. Amen.